People wanted again to hear more from Mr. Aubrey Norton. They wanted to really hear what he had to say, and it really was good because, you know, I always tell you, sometimes I'm really sorry that we have to come here and respond to some of the vile things that are coming from the opposition leaders, so to speak. But unfortunately, we have to respond because when you don't respond, again, people sometimes, you know, believe some of the things that he's saying. So we really had to get stuff out there from Aubrey Norton. So once again, thank you very much to him and everybody who continue to support Facing the Nation, especially at this time. We're going to continue on the political conversation today, even though this gentleman, this young man, he's no longer a politician, but people will continue to see him as a politician. I know there are some sentiments out there. People keep saying, why y'all don't pull him in? He has been on Facing the Nation maybe since 2016 or 2017, but it's my pleasure to have him back, especially at a time when the political climate is, you know, for want of a better term, it's, you know, it's unstable at this point. Many people see it as unstable because people are not sure what will happen after a certain time, again, because of the fear-mongering coming from the opposition. But it is my pleasure to welcome back to Facing the Nation, Mr. Nigel Hughes, attorney at Law Nigel Hughes. I'm so tempted to say politician, but I can't. Welcome back, sir.
You're very kind. Thank you very much. It's always a privilege to be on your program, and
Great.
Thank you for having me.
All right, wonderful. Viewers, of course, this is the only guest we're going to be having today on Facing the Nation. But again, you know, the wild statements continue. I have a statement from the government that some of you may have or may not heard or read a little later on in the program. Of course, after my conversation with Nigel Hughes, we're going to be reminding you of the government's position on everything that is happening now. The last time we spoke, Attorney at Law Hughes, we had a lengthy conversation, and I think it was constitutional reform. We're here again in terms of constitution, but in a different way. There is much talk about a constitutional crisis, and we're heading for that because of what happened in Parliament in December and what is happening now. You have one side saying A, another side saying B. First off, are we in constitutional crisis mode, or are we heading for that?
Crisis is always a strong term to use to describe where we are. I think if we are in any crisis, it's a crisis of people shouting at each other about what their various interpretations of the Constitution are. Let me start off by stating what perhaps is a pretty simple but fundamental fact. You can't have a country without a government. Okay. I think that's given. The Constitution clearly prescribes the roles for various independent agencies in the Constitution. It prescribes the role for the president. It prescribes several other and defines several other agencies and their respective constitutional powers. There was a vote, as you know, on the 21st of December. That vote on one of the articles of the Constitution would seem to suggest a particular result. But that result has to be taken in context and in consideration of the other provisions of the Constitution. Okay. It's unfortunate now that we are at the stage where we have, but I want to perhaps mention initially, like in any court case, at first instance, the party that is not victorious has a right to appeal that decision. And they have a right to appeal that decision until all their rights of appeal are fully exhausted. Right, so that is a right. That's a right you have. It's not a favor. Okay. If, when you get to the first level of the first appellate level, the judges are of the view that your appeal has no merit, they can say so. Okay. In this case, they're full-blown arguments, and I believe arguments on both sides are, the respective parties are allowed to put these forward. If you are unhappy with that decision at the Court of Appeal level, you're entitled to go all the way up to the Caribbean Court of Justice. And we know for sure, on either side here, whoever wins at the Court of Appeal, the other side is going to appeal to the Caribbean Court of Justice. That's a certainty. Okay. That's not speculation. That's what's going to happen. And that is a right they have. Now, I prefer to give you an example in the contrary. Assuming in the middle of this present appeal, they were, by some miracle, to have an election on the 22nd of March this year. This year, And there is a result of that election that is contrary to the result that we had in 2015. And then sometime in April, we get a ruling from the Caribbean Court of Justice that says the no confidence vote was invalid. So you have a ruling from the Caribbean Court of Justice that says the no confidence vote was invalid, but you've got a new president. What is the consequence of that? They're going to say that the new president was validly elected in office, and one side is going to say, what are you talking about? The president only got elected by virtue of a no confidence vote on the assumption that it was valid.
That it was valid. Mm-hmm.
It, in my view, is less than careful to put the country that's looking in the extreme position in that crisis. Just think about what would happen. So you have a decision from the CCJ that says the no confidence vote is invalid, and you have a new president. Think of the social disruption that will take place. It would be irresponsible to allow the country to get there, because there are certain people who are going to be very strongly of the view that the election is invalid because it came as a result of a process that flowed from an invalid no confidence vote. And you're going to have another part of our society, sadly we divided more or less on ethnic lines, it says, no, but you had an election. The president called the election.
So in saying all of that, sir, in your opinion, do we have social instabilities, again, for want of a better word, social disruption, any of that happening now?
No, I don't think the society, I don't think we have social instability. I certainly don't think there's anything unstable about where we are now. I mean, our institutions are functioning. There's no social unrest. It's not as if they have a strike. It's not as if law and order is on the threat. It's not as if there's a certain section of the population that feels that they're being particularly targeted. So the normal criteria that one would use to describe social instability is not there. What we have is a competition of various interpretations of the Constitution, bolstered by very, very acute political rhetoric, with the intent of creating an atmosphere of instability. So one of the criteria we normally look at, economics. Has there been a sudden downturn in investment in Guyana? Have people been pulling out their investments in Guyana? None of these things has been happening. So the sort of unrest, we don't have mass protests every day. We don't have, God forbid, people being shot. So the classic signs that one would look for in stability are not there. What we do have is a very, very acute and shrill political conversation taking place between two major political parties, not by, well, one of them maybe by their leader, but that has added to the tension in the society and has, I would say, made the racial climate more difficult and more challenged. And that has always been our problem. Now, I don't think that in that sort of environment that anybody, and I don't mean just the leaders, I don't think by myself, whoever, that we should add to anything that does not, or anything that may exacerbate those difficult circumstances. At the end of the day, we've identified a problem, and therefore I think as responsible people, we must be able to identify a solution. And we must pursue that in some sort of rational way. Like disputes between neighbors, shouting at each other doesn't solve it. At some stage, you gotta come to the table and talk. And I hope in Guyana's case, the examples throughout the world are there. Even in the worst of wars, in the worst of social crises, in the worst of civil uprisings, at the end of the day, you have to come to the table and talk. The Irish and the British had been at it for a long, long time. They had to come to the table and talk at Good Friday, and they came with an agreement. So we can either be mature about this and say, look, we don't have to go through more difficulty to come to where we will inevitably come, which is to talk. And in Guyana, I don't think elections solve our problem. The problem is really much deeper than that, and we have to have a conversation about what is really underlying this tension that is always there or surfaces around certain times.
I'm happy you talked about the fact that you don't think that election solves our problems, because this brings me to I want to call it an extended
I'm not saying we shouldn't have it, but I'm just saying it doesn't solve the problem.
It doesn't solve the problem. And it brings me to an extension, and where, you know, in my head I'm going to go into the parliament. Now I think it's for the last parliaments, regardless of who's in opposition, who's in government, you've been having a one-seat majority. Were you to go to the polls again, and again a one-seat majority, and somebody decides, look, I'm not satisfied, I'm this, I'm that, whether I pay somebody to do it or it just happens that you have a vote in parliament, and again, this one seat makes a difference. Forgive my ignorance here. I want to also link the question to constitutional reform. Would that solve this particular problem? And again, is it healthy if we keep having, there's always this one seat whereby you're not sure?
Okay, so constitutional reform, let me start off there. That's perhaps the easier place to start. Constitutional reform will not solve the problem, but it's the beginning of an attempt to resolve the problem. By magic, if we came up with a constitution that all of us agreed to, it doesn't solve the problem, because at the end of the day, we still harbor the feelings we harbor. That just becomes an instrument that is likely to provide an institution or a series of institutions that would add to confidence and reduce tension. But the Constitution in and of itself is not going to solve our problem. We have to start with a conversation. We have to look at the historic roots. We have to be candid. We have to be candid in our fears and begin to address that in a meaningful way, and then structure our institutions in a way that addresses all the concerns of the citizens. So that doesn't solve it. You asked me about whether a one-seat majority solves the problem. And again, I don't think it's a numerical issue for this reason. If you have ethnic differences that are easily played upon, if you have a population that is easily disposed to persuasion based on ethnic arguments, whether you have a 1, 2, 3-seat majority is not going to solve the problem, because at the end of the day, if you have a constitutional arrangement that says the person that gets into power can exercise all the power, and those who are out of power have no influence in the decision making, then the incentive of those who are not in power to play by the rules is going to be significantly reduced, because whether it's 1 seat, 2 seats, or whatever, in this case, whether there was a clear 2-seat advantage or not, it still doesn't begin to address the underlying fundamental problem. Unfortunately, and I'm sure you're going to ask me about it, in this case, Mr. Charandas, if one were to look at his previous conduct, it certainly did not indicate any increasing level of disquiet with the political party that he was a member of, or with the decisions that were being taken by that political party. To compare his actions with that of Dr. Ramaya. Dr. Ramaya, from the start, said he was opposed to the coalition between the Alliance for Change and the APNU. He was, from the start, very, he articulated his position in very, very strong terms, and he has consistently, or he had consistently exercised some level of disquiet about it, and he did what he thought was the right thing to do, and I believe is the right thing to do. He resigned. And that is what you do. In Mr. Charanas's case, up to, I think it was the week before, not only was there no indication of disquiet by him, there was fervent support by him for the government of the day, which is the Alliance, and his views were very clearly articulated in favor. And then he does the flip, and he says in an interview while he's overseas that his intention was to bring the government down. The danger with that is this. If somebody is going to use their political office for their specific personal views outside of what they have committed and what they have said to the people and have said publicly about their positions, it means that they're prepared to use their position in a manner that is inimical to the interests not only of their party, but of the state. You're saying, look, I am going to behave all my behavior is going to be based on subterfuge and sabotage. Now, if you want to introduce that as acceptable political conduct, what happens after that is that everybody is going to say, fine, if you think that that is the acceptable level in which you can represent people and you're prepared to use subterfuge and you're prepared to pretend to be one thing and then suddenly, like a chameleon, change because it achieves your end, it then justifies everybody else behaving the other way. And then the political morality dives because when we sit in Parliament, we're going to say, well, I don't know if tomorrow you're going to suddenly stab me behind the back, so let me stab you behind the back first. And there's nothing in that type of conduct that builds national consensus, that builds any sort of national development or an approach to national development that is healthy. As a matter of fact, it's particularly unhealthy. And in the Guyana case, unfortunately, what it does is it lends itself to notions that people have of the other. So Mr. Charnas happened to be of a particular ethnic group, and then both sides are going to take that for their own end. So rather than bringing out the best in us, in other words, rather than bringing out the aspirations or our best aspirations for the nation going forward, we are saying it is okay to use the lowest common denominator, subterfuge, what have you. And that just sours the entire political atmosphere. So whatever happens in an election, the reality is that there has been significant damage done to the relations, and of course, it requires work.
I'm eventually going to want to ask you about the ethnic tensions and so on, because I know apart from an attorney at law, you've been doing a lot of work and moving around Guyana, so you know what is happening. Is calling that treasonous behavior going too far?
You know, I wouldn't necessarily call it treasonous behavior. I just think it's how would I describe that? You know, if Mr. Charnas had been consistently complaining and what have you, I would have thought that the thing to do at some stage is to resign. Yeah, I mean, if you're, in my case, if you're unhappy with the conduct of your colleagues, and you're part of an organization, what you do is you step aside and you say, sorry, this is not what I'm about, and thank you for giving me, I'll go. I'm not sure it is acceptable for you to say, okay, because you don't like what I'm doing, I'm going to try and sabotage. That is sabotage. Now, whether that sabotage amongst the treason, I don't know. And one of the things is I'm always hesitant about treason, because treason is a political offense. I have defended 3 people who were on treason charges. They were dismissed at first instance, and that clearly, there was absolutely no evidence there on them. And so treason depends on where you stand in the political spectrum, and it's so subjective that I'm not sure that I would want to classify his behavior as treasonous, because it depends on the perspective that you come from. I certainly think that his conduct was less than consistent with the rules of not only decency, the rules of political arrangements. If you don't tell your colleagues that you're dissatisfied and you go to the extent of saying, look, I think you're doing a great job before, and the week after you go ahead and stab them in the back.
Deceitful.
Yeah, it's deceitful. Thank you. Yes.
Viewers, if you're now tuning in today, my conversation is with no stranger to Guyana, no stranger to this program either, attorney at Law Nigel Hughes. Now, we're going to, and I did reveal this to you earlier, in the beginning I tried to stay away from the 33-34 argument. I know you're going to eventually get to that as extensively as you possibly can at this point, because of course, viewers, we know when matters are in court, you can't really delve in too much. But I want to start here. There were questions after, whether immediately after or long after the vote in the National Assembly, before we heard from Nigel Hughes. The questions was, and viewers, this is not intended to embarrass or attack anyone. Why was this not known immediately? So my question basically to you is, do we have enough things happening with our politicians, our parliamentarians, our ministers, whereby people are trained? I know no individual can know everything, but where people are trained, what should be in place to ensure that, look, we are able to respond to these things immediately? You know,
that's bait, right?
That's
bait. No, not at all. I'm not going to shy away from that. I think perhaps the best way to look at this is to look at the chronology of events.
Okay.
back in 2014, what I said is not my idea at all. When I said 34-31 is the vote, that's not my idea. Back in 2014, when President Ramatar was in office and Mr. Nandalal was the Attorney General, Mr. Nandalal went to the private sector to a lawyer called Mr. Stephen Fraser and requested a legal opinion on what constitutes a majority in a no-confidence situation. That lawyer prepared an opinion and submitted it to the Attorney General, Mr. Anil Nandalal. And that opinion said that the count is 34-31 on this principle. And I think people get carried away because they see majority and then they then get caught into the argument of whether 33 is more than 32. It said, look, the way in which, first of all, the way in which the language of that article is constructed, it first of all means that the vote to remove a government in the case of lack of confidence is an absolute majority. It says the majority of the members of the National Assembly, and I don't really want to go into the technical details of it, but it is the equivalent of an absolute majority, which the Chief Justice accepted. Absolute majority is a formula. To determine what an absolute majority is, there's a specific formula that the law has identified. Not the mathematicians, the law has identified that formula. And that formula is that in the case where you require an absolute majority, the principle is you first have to identify half of whatever the number is, and then add 1. So it's not a majority of the people who turn up. It's not a majority of the people who happen to be there, whether they abstain or not. It's a fixed number. So half of the parliament, 32.5, plus 1 is 33.5. You clearly can't have a half person, so it's 34. The reason why you don't round down is because if it's half, that vote must be rounded up, because otherwise you're depriving a person of a vote. That's what the law says. Okay. So whatever the position is, that formula, the number was always 34. If 35 people turned up and 34 voted, it would pass. So it has nothing to do with presence. So it doesn't matter whether all the members turn up or less than the full complement. So in 2014, that opinion was delivered to President Ramatar. President Ramatar took a political decision that he was not going to accept that, because remember back in 2014, there was a lot of pressure on the government at the time, because he felt that there's no way the opposition would accept, if it went to the vote, that it's 34, if he said 34. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, and I've always held this view. If he had that opinion, my view would be, go to court and ask for an interpretation. So what you do, certainly as a leader, is you save the country this crisis that we're going through now, or whenever it comes up in future. Because clearly, if you have an opinion which you commissioned that said that this is the number, and it's given to the state, it's going to sit down in the Attorney General's chambers as part of the records. And if you lose the election, the next Attorney General is going to be aware of it, or ought to be aware of it. So, and therefore the crisis is going to come up, and therefore to avoid putting your country in crisis, go to court. And what they're doing now should have been done then. Before, so that we would have known back in 2014 what an absolute majority of the House was. Okay. And that would have diffused a lot of political pressure at the time, because the opposition, if the court ruled then that it is 34 based on the formula, couldn't jump up and say we're not accepting it, because we're a society that believes in the rule of law. Yes. But what we've done is the president then decided that he wasn't going to do it, and he left it. So we changed government in May 2015. I can't say whether or not that opinion was sitting in the Attorney General's office or otherwise, but it is there. So we roll around all the way to 2018, December the 21st. The vote passed. Well, the vote came up. Now, you must appreciate that on December 21st, at least Mr. Nandalal would have been aware that there was a legal opinion from a senior credible lawyer that said the vote is 34. I can't speak for the Attorney General. I don't know what the state of the records were in the Attorney General's chambers, but I would assume that he ought to have known as well. Okay. So you had at least one MP who had directly commissioned an opinion and had received an opinion from an attorney. Now, the Attorney General is not going to request an opinion from an average lawyer or less than average lawyer. So it clearly meant that at the time he identified Mr. Fraser as the lawyer to give the opinion, he felt he was competent. And he was sufficiently versed in the law to be able to deliver that opinion. So on December 21st, Mr. Nandalal was aware that the person who he identified as the competent lawyer to give an opinion on this subject had previously in 2014 told him it was 34. So he would have gone into that vote knowing that. If the systems worked the way they ought to, the Attorney General ought to have known that. So that's where we would have been on the 21st. The vote came on the Friday night. I thought, but you know, that somebody would have raised this issue during the course, right then. But even after that, to allow the President and the Prime Minister to go to a position where they would say, we accept the vote, we're moving forward, when you know that that is not a valid vote. And in the case of the opposition, the former Attorney General, I could understand the political advantage of wanting to stay quiet. But he must have anticipated at that time it was only a matter of time before this 34 issue would arise. And so on Sunday, I shared it. I wasn't sharing anything that was new. This was an opinion that was around. A matter of fact, Francis Alexis, who now is in the Court of Appeal, appearing for the state, in his classic book on fundamental rights, spoke about this, what an absolute majority was. And we had a decision from the former president of the Caribbean Court of Justice that interpreted the same language. Okay. So when it was when I put it up on Facebook, it wasn't my original idea, but of course, people, you know, took their interpretation.
Someone immediately made you an advice to the government.
Well, yes, of course. In Guyana, that is likely to happen. You know, depending on who benefits from what you say, then you are clearly supporting. Exactly. And so we then heard various statements, and it then came out that yes, I think I heard President Ramatara say that he had received that opinion, but he disregarded it. And Mr. Nandalal, I believe, said that. That's fine. You can disregard an opinion, and you can go and say, I don't agree with what this lawyer is saying. But if you are head of state and you've received that opinion, you must know that somebody else will hold that opinion. And where that opinion comes from a lawyer that you have identified as a person competent and capable to give you an opinion. For example, you won't go to a doctor who you think is a quack to advise you on the state of your heart. You go to an expert. So if you thought Mr. Fraser was an expert in 2014 and he gave you that opinion, even though you rejected that advice, you must know it's out there. So, and if you rejected it because you didn't think it would be acceptable or whatever, the point is somebody else thought it was a valid point. So to throw the country into this trauma where people say, no, you don't want to accept the result, and therefore you shouldn't appeal, and you've got all these people going into the press, and, sorry, I'm sorry, I must have hit that by accident. Yeah, all these people going into the press, and they're expressing these views. The point is it was there. This is nothing new, and if you, God forbid, have to deal with a situation you didn't anticipate, you've got to deal with it rationally. And so the country really is now in a position that was completely unavoidable. We could have had this determined by the court in 2014, when the advice was received. Yes. And we certainly had, at minimum, two, Mr. Nandalal and Mr. Williams, who were who were sitting in the National Assembly, who were aware that there was a legal position that said that the required number for a no confidence vote is 34. So, as a country, we have to rise and be responsible in the way we address these issues.
So, in saying all of that, now at the end of it, whenever the well, of course, as you did point out earlier, regardless of which side it's ruled in favor, we're going all the way to the CCJ. So, at the end of all of this, this problem should be fixed, so we will know what is accepted and what is not.
It's a minimum level of responsibility. You know, in Guyana, we're like Sisyphus. We push the rock up the mountain, it rolls back, then we push the same rock back up the mountain. We need to identify and have resolved all the potential areas of conflict, because it doesn't help the country. Every time somebody has a different interpretation, you know, we're in trouble.
Okay, all right, understood. Now, again, still quite a number of things to get to. One of the things that you said earlier that I found very interesting, I mean, it's a true fact. It's true, so therefore it's a fact.
It's a true fact. I like that.
It's true. Elections, we need those, but it's not going to solve all of our problems. And you talk about the ethnic tensions. Now, we have currently our government, and bless his heart, His Excellency President Granger, pushed for, even in the beginning, before the coalition with AFC, before collating with AFC, he pushed national unity. The name of the partnership is a partnership for national unity. He always talked about the fact that Guyana is not for one ethnicity or two ethnicities. We're a cook-up. We're basically a cook-up. But for some reason, we still, I mean, he has been pushing this since 2011. For some reason, we still have not been able to break that, what you want to call it, barrier into where, when, and at least this happens most times when there's election, you hear, oh, Indian voting for Indian, black voting for black. These are the facts, viewers. I'm not making this up. This is what is happening. But we have not been able to penetrate that. Your opinion, your thoughts on this, how can we move forward, move beyond a partnership for national unity to fix the problem?
The response to that, well, my response to that is this. I'm not sure that we have made sufficiently concerted efforts at genuinely attempting to address that problem. We all pay homage to the fact that yes, it's a bad thing, racism is bad, and we go through these platitudes and we come up with great names that sound good. But I am unaware, and I certainly don't know everything that happened politically in the country, of a genuine attempt to really go to the root causes of this ethnic problem. Apart from this is not just a question of our physical differences. It goes deeper. I mean,
yes.
Perhaps one of the areas of difficulty, the commencement of the challenges between the Africans and the Indians started with indentureship. Because when the Africans in 1838 the enslaved Africans were freed, they expected that they would be able to use the combined power of their labor, whether by union or otherwise, to negotiate fair wages for their labor on the estates. The British, who controlled the economy and controlled most of the world at the time, brought persons on contract from India to replace the African labor, thereby diminishing the power of the African labor, plus at the time. So it wasn't the best of initial meetings. So the initial meetings between the African and Indian was not born out of the happiest of circumstances. Mind you, most of our Indian brothers and sisters were confined to the estates. The Africans had to deal with the fact that the estate owners were flooding their lands. They couldn't get licenses, for example, to trade. So all those licenses to sell products to the Indian indentured laborers were given to the Portuguese. And all of this goes back, it sets up the economic framework for what we call Guyana today. So the Africans were literally shut out of economic activity. And even though they were shut out of economic activity, they were able to purchase several large estates on the coast cash. Yeah. Just think about that. Imagine purchasing Buxton, Vigilance, Victoria. Cash today. Just think of them. And these are people who just walked out of the most horrid circumstances. So, and then having acquired it and having mapped out in the village how these units would operate, where you would live, where you would graze, where you would cultivate your lands, you had a hostile planter class who were flooding your lands all the time. You had difficulties. Out of that is what we have to deal with here, and then coming through history, you've got all sorts of tensions that are coming up. We had the cent bread riots, which was really African revolt to Portuguese persons who were in the market selling bread above the market price and stifling them. So we have a difficult history, and we have to begin to grasp understand that when we start to craft a constitution about the future. So you've got real issues about African lands and the right to African lands, because a lot of African traditional lands are no longer in their names. The state came and took it and then started to distribute it And once the state is there, the state is the state. You don't know if it's, depending on who's in office,
Yeah.
you've got real issues. And of course, that has social and other consequences for the people of particular ethnicities, whether you start at a disadvantage or otherwise. Now, it is in all of that we have to discuss, our universities and the rest of our intellectual leadership have to begin to discuss that. And we as a people have to understand that, so that when we say we are one people, we understand we are truly one. Not just, oh, you know, we're one people. And it's a little bit more than political slogans. You live in a village next to people of different ethnicity. It's what's the reality? You have to trade. Somebody's got to buy, somebody's got to sell. What is the structure?
I'm not, because I know you're not inside, you're not a member of the government, and unfortunately, sadly, you're no longer a politician. But I'm asking you again, your opinion, has a department or a ministry of social cohesion that is designed really to bring people together, has that in any way, contributed, and especially based on all that you have just said, whereby we need to really find the root cause of the problem?
You're asking me to comment on the performance of that ministry, which is in effect what you are doing. You see, I would say I don't have. What are the programs? The question is really what programs have been undertaken. This is not a case where you have an African minister going into an Indian village and distributing, I don't know, shoes or what have you, or you're going to an indigenous area and you give away. That's not helping the problem. That's really quite patronizing, quite frankly. The question is, what programs are there to really bring us to a point where we say, I respect your challenge, and you respect my challenge, and we have to find a different way of creating a new Guyana. We now are sitting on the cusp of the greatest possible economic development, just by virtue of oil, that we've ever had in the past. This is greater than sugar.
Yeah.
And look at what we've done. In the year before we start production, we ourselves, we the citizens, black, Indian, indigenous, Chinese, whatever, we have allowed ourselves to end up in a position in which we are not going to prepare for it. We're more concerned with fighting each other, disrupting the one thing that can change our economic circumstances. And quite frankly, I don't think people realize the magnitude of what we have offshore that really is enough money to allow all of us a sort of social, economic development that will alleviate, we'll never get rid of, alleviate a lot of the problems. So whether it's infrastructure, health, education, people who didn't have opportunities, just think about what's before free education in 1974. If you came from a particular socioeconomic bracket, there was no way you were getting educated. Now we take it for granted. You can go to UG. We say, yeah, it's expensive, but you can go.
You can go, yeah.
If you were in 1969 and they had, the 60s, we had a Portuguese club, we had a red people club, we had a black people club, we had an Indian club. We're not there. And people who, and let me just give you an example. In the estates, if your father grew up in a boneyard, and by the time you were 11, 12, you were in the cane field or in the rice field planting. So your educational opportunities were limited. We're in a different place now where we take a lot for granted. And if we only think of the sort of transformational effect that could take place as a result of this bonanza in oil, if used properly, transparently, etc., then really we should be working together as to how we are going to create strong democratic institutions that give everybody an equal opportunity and don't only reward those that already have money or, depending on the economic. So we have this fantastic opportunity. We're spending it fighting each other, arguing about who should win and who should lose. And the reality is, whatever the result of the election, it is only going to increase the tension. So, sorry about that little rant, but... No,
that's all right. And it really, I'm happy that you put that spin on it, because indeed there is again, when things happen, everybody becomes an expert, especially those on social media. But you raise a really good point in that, in terms of the oil. Now, there is a lull in that. You want to know where the enthusiasm for that has gone, because everybody now is focusing on pending elections, what's going to happen after. Of course, some people running and screaming that the sky will fall after March 21st, but here we are.
I believe Chicken Licken lived,
Yes, got to reminder, right. Even after, yeah. I'm going to ask you this question, and you know, as I begin to wrap my conversation with you, and I thought that maybe a month ago or so, I had a conversation with the former PM, former mayor, former so many things, Mr. Hamilton Green. And I found it interesting that he talked. He even expressed that, you know, he doesn't share my pessimism on it. He talked about Guyana needing and Guyana being ready for what he calls a national front government, whereby you no longer have one political party in charge and whatnot. What are your thoughts on viewers, and I know some of you can misread things. This is not to ask Mr. Hughes to differ from what Hamilton Green has said. But do you think that we're in a position to push, promote, accept, embrace what he calls would be a national front government? Based on all the
I hear what you're saying. My approach to that would be that when you say national front government, what do you mean? A couple of politicians from across the political divide getting together and running the government? That's not, to me, the approach. The approach is, okay, how do we begin to have the conversation? So the question is, how are we going to structure that conversation? Is that conversation going to take place in the government? Is that conversation taking place elsewhere? I think because of ethnic insecurity, I think people like to see their own in the government. So at a shallow PR level, national front government is appealing. But let me, God forbid, pick a bad example. So if you have a national front government, so we got a perfect blend of indigenous, African, Indian, Chinese, what have you,
from various
parties. And these guys say, hey, we sitting down here in $3 trillion worth of oil. If we decide we're going to spend $2 billion on the local people and thief the rest, it's a national front government that could thief the rest. We can get excited because we get $3 billion when we ain't got it before, and everybody thinks that everything is fine. And you got a national front government. And that happens if you don't have underlying fundamental principles about what a national front government is going to do and what its task is. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need a national front government, but it's a little bit more than the window dressing of everybody sitting down at the table and we all saying kumbaya. Because that's not the solution. The solution is we have to do real work to get to a national solution. A national front government is only a step on the way to a permanent national solution that will reduce, or hopefully in an ideal world, remove the ethnic challenges that we have, and so that we embrace that there is a nation called Guyana, in which all of us subscribe to some basic principles about Guyana.
As I wrap up, what would Nigel Hughes, the citizens, like to say to his fellow Guyanese citizens at this time, especially at a time when you did talk about it already, tensions are high, people, you know, don't, again, acting as though the sky will fall, people don't know what will happen, they're uneasy, they're nervous, and I'm asking you this because I asked the politicians this, and you know what you expect them to say. But Nigel Hughes, the citizen, what do you want to tell Guyanese at this point?
I don't know. I think it's I wouldn't arrogate onto myself the right or
don't worry, I'm doing it today.
To say to people this is the solution, because I think you've got to come from a position of extreme confidence to be able to say this is the solution, or this is what you should be doing. And I don't assume that for a second. What I would like to share is perhaps at this point we need to pull back from where we're clearly pushing this process, and we need to sit down and decide what it is that we want for Guyana, for everybody.
Okay.
Not just whether we think we're going to score a point or whether our group may be in the ascendancy, and how are we going to get there? What is the process towards really creating a new Guyana? I'm optimistic, but it's a long fight. It is a long, long fight. And we have to start that conversation in our communities, in our villages, nationally, and it's got to be supported by the best intentions of our political leaders. Our political leaders cannot continue to appeal to the worst in us. So we can't chase anybody out. We can't decide we're putting people there because they're loyal to us or they look like us. We have to appeal to the best in us and really say to the country, this is how we begin to build a nation give him the absolute gift that we have got in the oil offshore. That's perhaps what I would
and
attempt
it's
to say.
perfect, and I'm sure everybody who got that message will embrace it. Thank you so very much.
Pleasure being here.
Viewers, if you're now tuning in, you missed a great one. This would have been a conversation with attorney at Law Nigel Hughes. Those of you who missed it, you know, subsequently you'll find it on my YouTube channel and also on Facebook. What I'll do is once again, thank you so very much for coming.
Thank you.
All right. What I'll do is take a quick break. On the other side of the break, I did promise you earlier to give you parts of it because it's a very long statement, the statement from the government of Guyana, again, responding to some of the nasty things that the opposition leader keeps spouting out there. And this message is basically just to remind you just to keep calm and, you know, not to fall prey to certain things. This is Facing the Nation. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with Facing the Nation. I did promise you earlier I will read that statement. I'll try to just pull some pieces of it because, as I did say, it's lengthy. It's a very long statement, warranted. And I noticed in some of the newspapers today, and for those of you who are on social media and so on, the statement is there. But I know sometimes I have a very different audience given the time that Facing the Nation is on during the day. So let me just get to it. The heading of it is President Granger remains president until another president is sworn in. Jack Deo's interpretation of Constitution flawed. This is Mr. Jack Deo's, because I try to give him at least the Mr. title. We all can't be as disrespectful as he is because he sits at his press conferences and he refers to the ministers and the president, and I can't imagine that he sits at a professional, what is supposed to be a professional forum. Imagine he's talking to members of the media and talking about Harmon and Granger. I mean, you don't want to say minister, or you don't want to say president. At least, you know, you can put the proper titles on their hands. So I'm trying to not be as him, as the way he is professionally vulgar, and to encourage young people and to remind them that that is not the way that you address superiors, colleagues, or else. You know, you have to be respectful. So let me just reread the title. President Granger remains president until another president is sworn in. Mr. Jack Deo's interpretation of Constitution is flawed. And just to remind you that the statement went out late yesterday as a response to some of the things that the opposition leader said during his press conference yesterday. The government of Guyana strongly condemns the continued misinformation being peddled by opposition leader Mr. Jack Deo that President Granger will cease to be president after March 21, 2019. At a press conference held on Thursday, the 14th of March, 2019, Mr. Jack Deo reiterated that President Granger will no longer be president after March 21. The government of Guyana deems Mr. Jack Deo's utterances as malicious and intended to create confusion amongst the populace. His statement is patently flawed and must be rejected outrightly. There is no provision in the Constitution, and this is what the government keeps stressing, the Constitution. We are functioning according to the Constitution. There is no provision in the Constitution of Guyana which requires the president to resign or demit office following the passage of a no-confidence motion. Chief Justice Acting Roxanne George on January 31, 2019, in the case of Attorney General versus the Speaker of the National Assembly and the Leader of the Opposition, declared that while the no-confidence motion against the government prompts the resignation of the cabinet and the hosting of elections, it does not dissolve the parliament, which comprises the National Assembly and the president. In fact, Article 1067 of the Constitution specifically states that the government remains in office and the National Assembly may pass a resolution to extend the time for elections beyond the 3-month period within which elections are required to be held. But as I did tell you that I will just, try to pick pieces out of it because it is very lengthy. The government, and this is, I'm going straight to the GCOM matter. The president therefore remains president until another president is sworn in. It should be noted that there are 4 processes which are running concurrently: the legislature, judiciary, electoral, and the executive. Article 62 of the Constitution of Guyana states that elections shall be independently supervised by the Elections Commission in accordance with the provisions of Article 162. The Constitution of Guyana states unequivocally that GCOM is an independent, autonomous body responsible for the hosting of free, fair, and credible elections. And the thing is, the government has been saying this over and over again. There are clips floating around where Mr. Jagdeo himself, I think it's back in 2006, said that GCOM is autonomous. So I'm not really sure what is happening. I'm not sure that he is sure what is happening. President Granger cannot interfere in GCOM's work. He has to be advised by the Commission of its readiness to host election. And again, this part of the statement is saying this: the President has repeatedly said that he is committed to holding credible elections. The government of Guyana is concerned that the leader of the opposition continues to peddle misinformation, and viewers, I must remind you, he does this every week. Continues to peddle misinformation in the public domain with the intent to confuse and create panic among citizens. And I'd like to take this opportunity to remind citizens that, you should not be fearful. Don't allow him to drive a panic in you. The fear-mongering, he's purposely doing it. He knows exactly what he's doing. But remember, you're children of God, so fear not. It views as reckless his statements and calls on him to act responsibly during this very sensitive period in the country's history. I agree with the government there, but I am not sure that he wants to act responsibly, or at least even, with an ounce of maturity. On Monday, March 11, 2019, the government condemned Mr. Jagdeo's inciting remarks, which he had initially made at a memorial ceremony at Babujan, Port Moran, Quarantine East Berbice. Of course, that's in Region 6, noting that they could lead to a breach of peace and public order. Mr. Jagdeo again yesterday indulged himself in reiterating these remarks at the press conference, seemingly without any consideration of the possible confrontational outcomes that they could engender, which may jeopardize the safety and security of the sitting president and his ministers. The government reiterates that the irresponsible call by Mr. Jagdeo to, quote, chase President Granger, Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu, and government ministers out of their communities is dangerous and unacceptable, particularly in an election year. The government therefore encourages the public to exercise good sense and to desist from disorderly behavior, as the law enforcement agencies will treat condignly any disorderly conduct. So there you have it. Again, it was a bit lengthy, and I'm, straining my voice because, excuse me if I was a bit rusty, but I'm still recovering from a very terrible cold. But it was a long statement. We can say as much as we want. The public relations personnel and the government itself can say as much as it wants. But I like to remind you, as citizens, the onus is always on you. Be responsible. Decide what sort of adult you want to be. Decide what sort of citizen you want to be. You get to decide. You get to sit and think. Are you feeling safe? Are you feeling peaceful? And do you want it to continue? And are you going to allow an irrational individual? At least, I'm sorry to say he's irrational, but at least he's acting irrational. Are you going to allow him to penetrate your thoughts and influence you. And I am not talking here only to supporters of the government. I'm also talking to supporters of the PPP and to supporters of the opposition. You decide if the things that he is saying are right. You decide if that is the road, that is the path that you want to go down. You decide if you want to sell your soul, and we take it from there. But I trust at the end of it, you'll choose peace, and you'll choose, you know, to let us remain in a state where we're all calm and rational. And again, I always tell people this. Some sections of society will support the government. I mean, we would love if the entire country supports the government fully, but that is unreal. That is not realistic. So we accept there are going to be some persons who are going to be for this government, and there are going to be some persons who are going to be against this government. And that is fine. That is quite fine. But at the end of it, you put maturity, you put country first, and you put rationality in it. Do you want us to live long? Do you want us to continue to be healthy? Do you want us to have a safe, a secure, and a calm and peaceful society? Again, you get to decide, and I hope you choose peace at the end of it. I am going to leave our conversation there for today, our talk for today, because as I said to you, I'm, still really straining my voice. I want to take this opportunity to once again thank Attorney at Law Nigel Hughes for coming and sharing with us his opinions, sharing facts. We really are grateful for that. Again, as I did say, those of you who are now joining us and you've missed the majority of the program, subsequently you can find it on my YouTube channel and also on my Facebook pages. Trust that in the coming weeks we'll have more conversations like these, just to enlighten people, to remind people. And again, in all of this, remember that in all of the confusion and what for so many persons right now is mental turmoil, because you every time you turn on the news or you open the newspapers, it's something and people are uneasy. But remember that in all of this, what these conversations are doing is teaching you about Guyana, so in a sense you are still benefiting, because when the dust eventually settles, you will be more knowledgeable and more informed on the way your country works, the way it has worked, and the way it should be working. So at the end of the day, you're still learning. So in the coming weeks, we'll try to get more conversations like this here for you. As always, I want to thank you for supporting Facing the Nation. Of course, thank you very much for tuning in. That's all the time I have with you this week. Until next time, I am Malika Ramsey. Be good Guyanese citizens. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, this has been Facing the Nation.